Okay, welcome everyone to this course on Shabtai Tzvi. I'm very excited to be teaching this course. It's going to be a little bit different than our usual Livnos courses, and I think really fun. So we're going to get to explore an interesting period in Jewish history that is often kind of like a mystery to us, what exactly took place. And hopefully we're going to learn about not only what took place in the past, but how this enables us to better understand what's going on now in the world, and what our role is um, in whatever time period in history we find ourselves. So it's going to be a very interesting course. I'm going to discuss that a little bit tonight of what the goal of learning Jewish history is and what the goal in this class is. Um, I want to also mention that this is our first Jewish history class on Livnos. So it's exciting because Jewish history is such an important part of the Jewish experience and of learning. And it's also very interesting. And hopefully, Mir Hashem, we're going to have a lot more courses on Jewish history. So this is just the beginning of, hopefully, Mir Hashem, amazing courses to come. In general, one thing that I want to mention about learning Jewish history, which is true about this course and really every Jewish history course, and also about history in general, is that we can really learn history in one of two ways. Either we can approach it as kind of like, just kind of a story and a bunch of facts and a bunch of things that took place in the past, and kind of look at it as, things that are in the past and that are maybe interesting. If someone's, intellectually curious, you might be interested what took place. And you kind of just learn it as what happened and then, leave it. But there's another way of learning history, which is to understand that history is really a study of human nature. It's a study of certain themes that take place over and over again throughout history, throughout the world, right? It takes place now and it will continue for the rest of human history, right? It's how it will continue forever because as much as certain realities change and certain situations change, human nature is always the same. And certain themes that existed in history will always continue to exist, no matter if we have computers, no matter if we live in America and speak English, or if someone lived in Germany, or if they spoke French. None of that really matters. If we go to the heart and soul of what took place in history, and we really learn it within a mature approach and really understand what took place, what were different people's motivations for why they behaved a certain way, what were certain causes that created certain outcomes that were either positive or negative. Right? When we look at history, we really understand why did certain things take place. Then we can understand what those teach us for our own times, right? How to approach different situations that we find ourselves in. And that's true for all of history, as you mentioned, but for Jewish history especially, right? Jewish history has so much to teach us about the experience of what it means to be a Jew and how a Torah Jew, how a Gadol, how a Torah Jew responds to different things that take place, right? These are our teachers, right? They're the ones who guide us in how to respond to the situations and how to confront the challenges that we find ourselves in currently. So the story of Shabtai Tzvi specifically is a fascinating story because here is a time when so many people were fooled by what they were told, right? It goes down in history as like a huge, we're going to talk about the results of what took place in this moment in history. This is a major event in Jewish history. And it's something that when we look back at it, it's kind of hard to understand, like, why were so many people fooled? Were they ignorant? Did they not have the information that would have clarified what was taking place? Like, what was going on? Now, if we take that first approach to studying history and we just kind of like look back and, oh, it's so interesting. And maybe if they had had phones or email, maybe they would have known more, right? If we think that it was just kind of like something that took place in the past, which is just of interest to us, so then there's nothing to learn, right? If we look at these people in the story of Shabtai Tzvi as being just like ignorant or fools or something like that, so then this is a story that took place in the past that we can't learn from. But if we understand that as much as our situation might be a little different than the people in Shabtai Tzvi's time, human nature is still the same. And if people were able to be fooled back then, means that people can be fooled today as well. That's what it really means, right? We're going to talk about the factors that contributed to Shabtai Tzvi's success, and we're going to see that he wasn't successful because people didn't know what was going on in that country, or people weren't paying attention. No, he was able to deceive people and to gain followers because he used certain strategies that persuade people, right, that convince them to follow him. And if he used certain strategies that persuaded masses and masses of people to follow him, it means that the same thing can happen today. The same thing can happen in 100 years from now. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what technology we have. It doesn't matter, if we all have college degrees. None of that matters. If there was a situation in which people who were paying attention, okay, they were looking at what was taking place. And because they listened to what he said and to what he did, they were able to be fooled into following him. It means the same can happen throughout history. This is true about human nature. Now, right now, we're not maybe yet convinced because we need to see what were the tools that Shabtai Tzvi used. What did he do in order to convince the masses to follow him? Once we see some of the tools that he used, we're going to see that these are tools that people use nowadays as well. It's something that we see all the time. We're constantly confronting different propaganda, different tools of deception, of manipulation, and we don't always realize it. And when we don't always realize it, so then we're vulnerable. But as soon as we have the tools to detect sheker, right, to detect somebody who is presenting something to us that is false or that's manipulative, then we'll be able to protect ourselves, right, and to be more confident in ourselves and to make sure that we're always following the truth. We're always following the true Torah path. So this is going to be a very, an interesting kind of experience as we look through the story of Shabtai Tzvi, really through the eyes both of the Torah and Chazal. Okay, to understand the Torah gives us the guidance necessary in order to protect ourselves from sheker. The Torah helps us to grab onto truth so that we can navigate through life, through gullahs, through all the challenges that we face, and stay loyal to the Torah, loyal to the truth. So we're going to look at this story through the eyes of the Torah, through the eyes of Chazal, in order to understand some of the tools that Shabtai Tzvi used, okay? And we're also going to look at the story through the eyes of our own time, of our own experience. Because as we go through the world, we see that there are different ways that that either people or organizations or governments or politicians, whatever it is, that they present things in certain ways that are maybe somewhat deceitful, right? That are propaganda. They have a certain agenda. And when we understand through history, through the eyes of the Torah and Chazal, we can look at history, we can look at our own times, and we can see that there are so many, ways, so many tools that sheker uses in order to fool us. So what we're going to do in this story is we're not going to be limited to the story of Shabtai Tzvi. Okay, we're going to look at Shabtai Tzvi, at the story, using different historical sources, using different diaries from the times, okay? And we're going to give it life by using the Torah and Chazal to understand what was taking place. And we're going to see how all of this is true in our own time as well. Okay, all of that is going to be connected. It's all one, right? History is not just about a moment in time, but it's part of a larger story, a larger theme. And that theme is told to us in the Torah, and it's something that we can continue to see nowadays. And I want to just mention that as we talk about this and as we go through different, let's say, tools of deceit, right? Tools that sheker uses in order to fool others. I want to mention that, first of all, it's not always on purpose. Okay? It doesn't always mean that there's some evil intent. It's not like that. And it might not be, again, it might not be on purpose. It might not be an evil intent, but it's part of the world that we live in, and we're aware of this, right? We live in a world with a lot of marketing, with a lot of propaganda, with a lot of agendas. It's part of the way that the world works. It doesn't mean that people are always out to get us necessarily, right? But it means that we should understand, as people who live in a world, yeah, there is marketing out there, right? There's a lot of people who make money advising how to, speak to certain audiences, right? That's part of the reality of the world we live in. Sometimes it might be for an evil intent. Sometimes it might not, but we should be, as people who live in this world, we want to be prepared, right, to confront whatever we're facing and to make sure that we are the ones in charge of our choices. We are the ones who are, we're in charge. We're in charge of ourselves, and we shouldn't give over that control to anyone else. I also want to mention one more important thing, and this is so important, for any looking at any, story where someone was manipulated, but for sure the story of Shabtai Tzvi. One of the people who fools us the most and who lies to us the most is ourselves. We have an amazing, amazing power to deceive ourselves, which is terrifying because when others try to deceive us, so that poses a certain challenge, that's a certain danger. But when we lie to ourselves, that's terrifying because it is so hard to detect when we are lying to ourselves. It's the most dangerous. It's so hard to detect and it's the most powerful. And that's something that we see very, very often. If we were to take a stand back and to really analyze ourselves, to evaluate the choices we're making, and if we could do that objectively, right, with no bias, no emotion, we would see that the person who's constantly lying to ourselves is us, right? We are always lying to ourselves. And that's something that as we go through the story of Shabtai Tzvi, we're also going to see not just how others try to manipulate us, not just how others, Shabtai Tzvi and his group tried to manipulate the masses, but also how the masses themselves wanted to be manipulated, how they were ready. And that's something that's so much more terrifying. So it's something we have to keep in mind is not only to just look at like, oh, externally, what everyone else is doing, but to look at ourselves and to say, in what area of my life might I be lying to myself? So as we go through the story, and we're going to mention something that happened historically in the story, and then we're going to talk about the tools. Thank you, Ms. Kosowski. I appreciate your input. We're going to talk not just about the tools that they used, right, in order to manipulate. As we go through, we're going to mention the exact tools that they used when they were manipulating the masses. But we're going to stop and say, hold on, here's a tool in which people manipulate themselves. People lie to themselves. And again, that's the most terrifying. So that's something that we want to really pay attention to and take note of, and to make sure that in our own lives, right, we're people who are always working on being truthful with ourselves, right? At least not to lie to ourselves. There are so many people out there who want to lie to us. At least, the one person we should be able to trust is ourselves. And a lot of times that's the hardest person to trust. So we want to figure out how we can become a more honest person with ourselves. Okay. Okay, any questions so far? Any comments? Okay. Okay, I just want to mention again. Yeah, Mrs. Kosowski. Oh, you're on mute.
Quick question.
Mhm.
How does this deception story compare to Bar Kokhba? Like, which was a bigger situation of people believing this is the false Mashiach?
That's
I
a
know they're very
great.
different time. They're very different time periods, and maybe you could tell us what those are. But yeah.
Okay, that's a great question. I do want to do, if we have time, then at the end, I do want to discuss other, let's say, false messianic movements, and compare them a little bit and to see, like, how they compare and also what those movements have to tell us. So I wasn't thinking of doing Bar Kokhba, but we could definitely add that one in. And then maybe when we get there, we'll discuss more of how it relates. It is a very different, kind of story. But it's definitely worth comparing when we get there. So thank you for bringing that up. And of course, we know in that story, right, there were Gedolim who discussed the possibility of him being Mashiach, right? So that's, that tells us a lot of what we have to know is that these things are not, they're complex, right? They are complex subjects. Okay. Okay, one more piece that I want to just mention, part of our introduction, is that very often also, so, I'll give you an example. One time I was reading an article and it was advocating for some political I don't know, maybe some new law to be established. I don't remember exactly the context, but I agreed with what the author was saying in terms of his conclusion. I agreed that whatever he wanted politically to be put into effect, I agreed with what he was saying. But as I read the article, he gave like 4 or 5 proofs, 4 or 5 like reasoning of why he thought that this conclusion was true. And I remember that I completely disagreed with all of his reasoning. I agreed with the conclusion that this law should be put into effect, but I didn't agree with the reasoning behind it. And it made me realize something very important. I think it's very important as we go through this class and in general in life, is that we have a lot of times, different ideas, different statements, different arguments that are being told to us, and we might agree with the conclusion of the argument, right? We might agree with whatever practical result, the whether it's political or something else, we might agree with the result. Or maybe it's a personal choice, right? Maybe it's something in our life we want to make a choice, and we might agree with a certain, action, right? Taking a certain, going with a certain practical application, right? But we don't necessarily agree with the reasoning behind someone else's argument. We don't necessarily agree with their reasoning of how they came to whatever outcome they came to. So what I want to just mention is that it's important for us to remember that even if we agree with what someone says to do politically, let's say they say, oh, put this law into effect, it doesn't mean that we agree with their reasoning. And I think it's very important, especially as Torah people, right, to make sure, sometimes we have this in politics that somebody will say, oh, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. And then they have to agree with every single thing that the Democrats say, or they have to agree with every single thing the Republicans say. And that's really not true, right? Just because you take a certain party generally, and maybe you're going to vote for that, that person, doesn't mean you have to agree with every single thing they say. And it doesn't mean that you have to agree with the reasoning behind every single thing, right? Especially as Torah Jews. If the Torah, let's say the Torah, you think the Torah agrees 90% with a certain party, but the last 10% the Torah doesn't agree with, then that's what you're loyal to. We're loyal to the Torah. The Torah is right. We don't need to be loyal, let's say, to a certain party or to a certain person or to a certain law, right? Even if we, again, agree with the law itself, we don't need to agree with the reasoning. So I just mentioned that in this class, there might be certain times where, let's say I bring you an example of a certain argument that I saw in a newspaper. I might even agree with the conclusion of what the author is saying. I might agree with this law, but we don't necessarily need to agree with the argument of how the person got there, with the reasoning of how the person got there. And I think that's a very important differentiation to make, is that we can agree with certain things that someone says, but it doesn't mean we accept 100% of what they say. And it doesn't mean we agree with the reasoning behind it. So again, if we talk about, one of the things we'll talk about is an emotional argument, right? When someone makes an argument and the whole basis for the argument is emotion, but it's not, let's say, a logical argument of what is moral or immoral or correct, or right? It's not about that. It's about something emotional. It doesn't mean that the emotional argument will lead to something wrong by definition. An emotional argument might lead to something which in the end could be correct, but how the person got there might not really be a valid argument. So I think it's something just to keep in mind. I am going to try for this class to bring examples, different things, we'll discuss, let's say, a tool of deception, and I'll bring examples that exist today, right, where we see this being used today, and I'm going to try my best to keep it not controversial, right? That's not the point of this class. But I want you to just keep in mind that if I do bring an argument and you agree with whatever, let's say the political view of the author, I might also agree, but we have to see if the reasoning behind the argument is correct. Okay, if that reasoning is, does it hold up against logic and morality, or is it something based on pure emotion? Or is it something, or is the way it's presented manipulative? Okay, so I just want to keep that in mind, that it's important to train ourselves also to make sure that when we're reading the newspaper or we're listening to an argument about something, that we're evaluating it based on, does the reasoning hold up, right? Is this proper reasoning? Or is there some sort of agenda or propaganda here? Is there manipulation, right? Even if, again, we agree with the end result, we need to make sure that we're listening, right? That we're focused on what the person's saying and we're not letting them manipulate us. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. I will say, again, I'm going to try my best to stay out of anything controversial. I'm gonna only quote things if I think, they it would be something that, we would in general all agree. Or again, maybe I think the argument itself was made in such a dramatically, in such a dramatically manipulative way, even if the result is correct. But I'm gonna try to stay out of anything controversial. So I apologize in advance if anything is said which is, you know, which bothers someone. I'm not trying to make this a political kind of, class. If anyone would like, when I write down my own examples, so I write down a few examples that I want to share in class, and I also write down a few examples where I've seen it more dramatically, in ways that are more controversial that I decided not to share in class. If anyone would like, on any of the topics that we discussed, if anyone would like more examples and they want to see more of the, the list of examples that I've seen it with and, other articles where I've seen it, I'm happy to share those, if you want to email me. I'm just not going to share them publicly, but again, those are available if anyone's interested. Okay. Okay, and I'm just going to again mention that in this class, some of the sources that I've used are historical sources about Shabtai Tzvi, really like secondary sources. I also have used a few diaries from the time, um, which they're, very helpful in helping us to kind of detect, right, how a lot of the, Shabtai Tzvi's arguments were being received, right? So it's very helpful in that way to see people who were living through it. And also I have used, various, I'll show you as we go through, various sources from Chazal or from modern Svarim that talk about things like Mashiach and, things like that. And again, some of it is, as I've been, the first time I taught this course was, I think, about 3 years ago now. So since I first started teaching this course where I tried to detect certain things that happened in Shabtai Tzvi's time, so at the beginning I detected a few things. When I looked through the sources, I saw like, oh, this is a method of manipulation and this is. But a lot of them are hard to detect because, we don't have the full story in front of us, right? We weren't there. So there's kind of a summarized version that it's a little hard to see what exactly did they do? How were they so successful? And what I've seen is since I started preparing this class 3 years ago, as I'm just going through my life, something will happen and all of a sudden it clicks that I'm looking at something, maybe it's in an article or something else, and it's a method that Shabtai Tzvi used. And it's enabled me through using my own experiences and looking at the story of Shabtai Tzvi at the same time, I've seen certain themes that at first I didn't even realize how genius it was to to present things in a certain way. And all of a sudden I'm looking at a newspaper now and it reminds me of something that happened in Shabtai Tzvi's time. And it really it kind of gets something right under without you realizing it. So it's something to keep in mind. I encourage you as we go through the story to please think if there's something that jumps out at you, that you think, oh wow, that's pretty powerful tool, right? That might have been something which could have fooled a lot of people, right? And you might see this as you're going through the story together with me. It might also be that as you're going around in your own life, all of a sudden you see something and oh, never mind. Like, you might see something in general, right? If we all look around in our own lives, we definitely can find ways that there is, propaganda, right? Or something, some sort of manipulation in different articles we read. But you might see that something reminds you of the story of Shabtai Tzvi. Please feel free to email me to share it. Um, we can learn a lot when we look at history and our own time together. We can really learn a lot about both. And those are tools for us for navigating our lives now, right? In 2024, we can learn so much from the story of Shabtai Tzvi, right? And it enables us to see so much more what's going on in our own times. Yes, Mrs. Ksovsky.
I just want to add that what you talked about before, the most dangerous lies are the ones you think are true. If you study at all cults, the cult leaders, I think his name was Jim Jones. Was he the one that had everybody die? Like he really believed his own craziness. So I think that's an interesting point. It wasn't like, oh, I know the truth and let me try to fool everyone else. I think the reason he was so powerful is he believed his own insanity. And so
Yeah,
he was
exactly.
much more effective when he tried to get other people to believe his own insanity. So I don't know Shabtai Tzvi's story yet. It could be some of these leaders really think they are Mashiach, and that's what makes them so scary.
Yeah, we're definitely going to see that theme in this story as well. And it's true, that is something that's so much more powerful, right? If somebody, kind of presents themselves, right? And they themselves know they're lying. So that, might come out a certain way. It might be presented a certain way, right? But definitely if somebody has their own, they've convinced themselves, which we said is convincing ourselves is a powerful, powerful thing, right? It's definitely possible for someone to convince themselves of certain ideas, right? And then when they present it, it has that air of truth, of sincerity, right? So that's definitely something that we have to be careful of, and we're going to see that in this story as well. Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's start. Before we really go into the story, I want to give a little bit of the background of what was taking place at this time, which of course is very important with history because things don't happen in a vacuum, right? There's always something that came before that contributed to what comes next. So we're going to just do this very, very quickly. So what we're going to focus on tonight is the background to the story of Shabtai Tzvi, which is extremely important. It really enables us to understand a lot of how this took place. I mean, once we have the background really down, it's going to be like almost no questions on why Shabtai Tzvi was successful. It was very, very powerful what was taking place at this time. So, and this is the background really is the Khmelnytsky pogroms, right? The Gzeros Tach V'Tah. So, in the 1500s, in Poland, right? That was some of the major Torah centers were in Poland. Torah was flourishing, right? We can talk for a long time about how the gedolim of the time, right? And the amount of Torah at the time. It was really a very powerful time of Torah in Poland in the 1500s. And yet, despite the fact that the people in Poland were, some of the most major tzaddikim of the time, right? And they were very, very, they were huge tzaddikim, right? There was a very, these were people who were living their lives according to the Torah. And yet, despite that, we have in 1648 to 1649, we have one of the worst attacks against the Jewish community at this time, right, by the Ukrainians. And this goes down in Jewish history as one of the most really savage attacks against the Jewish people, right? And it's known as Gzeros Tach V'Tah because that is the year in Hebrew, right? 5408 to 5409 is when these attacks took place against the Jewish community. I want to just mention here, and not to get into politics, but I do just want to mention this, which is that in the war between Russia and Ukraine, there came out all of these things, in the Jewish community and in the world of who do we support, Russia and Ukraine. And I'm not going to get into that because that doesn't matter for my class. But I do just want to mention one thing, which is I saw a lot of people in the Jewish community saying things like, oh, we should support Ukraine because the Ukrainians have been the kindest to us. They've always been hospitable to us and they've always been nice to us and they've never attacked the Jewish community and they've always been our friends. And because I heard a lot of people saying that, I feel the need to just mention that the Gzeros Tach V'Tah, which was such a savage attack against the Jewish community, it was unbelievable. And we're going to read some of the things that took place in a minute. But it was really something. It wasn't even just the amount of Jews that were killed. It was the cruelty that took place. It was really revolting. It's disgusting. I mean, we can't even put it into words. And it was really done by the Ukrainians against the Jewish community because the Ukrainians hated the Jewish community. If you look into the history of the time, although the Ukrainians and the Jews weren't friends, there really was no reason for the Ukrainians to specifically attack the Jewish community. And yet the Ukrainians hated the Jewish community so much that they attacked them in a very savage way. And so I just feel the need, whatever you want to do politically right now between Russia and Ukraine, that's your own business. But just to keep in mind that if you hear things like, oh, the Ukrainians were always so nice to us, the Gzeros Tach V'Tah, which is one of the worst moments in Jewish history, were done by the Ukrainians for really no reason. And it was something, we're going to read now an account from a rabbi at the time where he records what took place in this really short time. I mean, it was less than 2 years, these attacks against the Jewish community. And there are different accounts of how many Jews were killed. Some people say 100,000 Jews were killed. Can you imagine 100,000 Jews killed in this short time, really for no reason? So the Gzeros Tach V'Tah, which again, it came out of nowhere, And all of a sudden, the Jewish community was attacked in brutal ways, and huge amounts of Jews, 100,000 Jews, I mean, that's a huge amount. All of a sudden, they were just killed for no reason. Let's look at that together. Okay, and I think, if we were to read this without any context in our own lives, we would see how disgusting it is what took place. But now we also have a concept of what it means to actually experience anti-Semitism and to experience, gullus, right? Until now, a lot of us haven't really experienced gullus in the true sense of the word. And now we do have an experience of that. So let's read these words also with an understanding of our own experiences of Jewish history and, with an understanding of what these people were going through. So here I'll just mention, so this comes from the Yevon Metzulah, which is, again, an account of a rabbi who lived at the time, and he records these attacks against the Jewish community. You can get this book, you can read it for free online, and here, sorry, I'll put it, you can read the translation. It's called The Abyss of Despair. And you can see it online if you want to, just have some clarity of what took place during this time with the Jewish community. Now, we're just going to read this short piece just to have an idea of the brutal attacks against the Jewish community. And here we'll start here, the seventh line down in the middle. It says, these persons died cruel and bitter deaths. Listen to what the Ukrainians did against the Jewish community. Okay, here, starting from some. Sorry, now it's the sixth line down. Some were skinned alive and their flesh was thrown to the dogs. Some had their hands and limbs chopped off and their bodies thrown on the highway, only to be trampled by wagons and crushed by horses. Some had wounds inflicted upon them and thrown on the street to die a slow death. They writhed in their blood until they breathed their last. Others were buried alive. The enemy slaughtered infants in the laps of their mothers. They were sliced into pieces like fish. Listen to this. They slashed the bellies of pregnant women, removed their infants, and tossed them in their faces. Some women had their bellies torn open and live cats placed in them. They tore women's bodies open and put live cats into them. The bellies were then sewed up with the live cats remaining within. They chopped off the hands of the victims so that they would not be able to remove the cats from their bellies. The infants were hung on the breasts of their mothers. Some children were pierced with spears, roasted on the fire, and then brought to their mothers to be eaten. Many times they used the bodies of Jewish children as improvised bridges upon which they later crossed. There was no cruel device of murder in the whole world that was not perpetuated by the enemies. Okay, and here he talks a little bit more about some of the cruel ways that they tortured the Jewish community. I mean, when I first read this piece, I was so shocked how somebody could even think of doing this. Like the creativity it took and the amount of work it took to torture these innocent people, women and children. I mean, you look here, it's like the level of cruelty. And again, creativity. I mean, how did they even think of this? To slash women open and put live cats in them and then sew them up? I mean, who even thinks of that? The level of evil, of cruelty it takes to come up with that, it's horrifying, right? I think for people like us who are, we the Jewish community, we're Rahmanim. We don't even have this concept. Like, we would never be able to come up with something like that. And we would definitely never do it, right? It means horrifying to think to these innocent women and children who did nothing to them for no reason. So you think about what took place here, this level of torture, of pain, the innocent Jewish community. And you think about the experience of the time out of nowhere, all of this happened. It was the level of pain that the Jewish community experienced to these major communities in Poland, these major Torah centers that were destroyed. The Polish Jewish community at this time was destroyed. They were tortured and destroyed in a short amount of time for no reason. For no reason in the physical world, right? They didn't threaten anyone. Like, why? Why would anyone attack them? But also in the spiritual world. Why in the world did they deserve this? Right? If we know that Hashem is running the world, like, why? Why would this happen to these tzaddikim? And the Jewish community, they were shocked and horrified and traumatized because they just couldn't understand what just happened. And like, what were they supposed to do now? It was a moment in Jewish history filled with pain and confusion. And the Jewish community just didn't know like how to deal with this. Okay, and this is the context that we're talking about. We're talking about a moment of Jewish history, one of the most painful moments in Jewish history. There have been a nice amount of painful moments in Jewish history, and this goes down as one of the worst, one of the most shocking, and one of the most traumatizing. Okay, so this is the background of the time that we're dealing with before Shabtai Tzvi. And this takes place again in the year 1648 to 49. Now, a little bit of background to that story, which is that the Zohar gives a calculation of some major event, right? Some I don't remember actually now exactly how it's worded in the Zohar, okay? But some sort of messianic kind of calculation that in the year 5408, remember that's the year on the Jewish calendar of Tach B'Tat, okay? In the year 5408, Mashiach would come. Okay, so the Jewish people at this time, they had been waiting, excitedly awaiting that this could be the year of Mashiach, right? They were looking forward, finally, so many years of Gullus, centuries of Gullus, of pain, of torture, of waiting for Mashiach, of having to endure terrible, terrible persecution, right, from everyone. And finally, Mashiach would come, and they were excitedly awaiting the year 5408, and instead of a year of celebration and happiness and Mashiach, instead they had a year of trauma and pain and torture. And the Jewish community at this time, like, how? You think about this, how would the Jewish community go on? It's so difficult. Okay, so not only did the Jewish community have this shock and this pain, but also the level of disappointment and like, to not believe that this could possibly be what's taking place. How could this be that this is the outcome? This is the year they were waiting for. How can this be what took place? Okay, so the only answer that they could come up with is this must be Mashiach. This is the Chavle Mashiach, right? We have this concept that before Mashiach, there is going to be a period of pain, which will then lead into Mashiach, right? That's called the Chavle Mashiach. It's the birth pains of Mashiach. So they came to this, they started to think, well, we were waiting for Mashiach. This was supposed to be the year of Mashiach. And all of a sudden, these major Torah centers have been attacked for no apparent reason. It must be that this is just the beginning of the messianic process. This is the Chavle Mashiach. And so at this moment in history, right, this was something that they held on to. It had to be. It had to be that this is Mashiach. And so if you think about it in these terms, anyone who would appear at this moment and would say, I'm Mashiach, they'd be ready to accept him because they needed this to be Mashiach. What else? It had to be Mashiach. And so even before Shabtai Tzvi shows up, they are already convinced this is Mashiach. Okay, so that's something before we analyze this piece, right? Just to think about, like the job was already halfway done. Anyone who shows up, they are ready to accept him. Okay, so even before Shabtai Tzvi has to do anything, right? It's already, the situation is set up for him to be successful. Okay. Okay, any questions or comments on what we've said so far? Okay, so I want to mention here really two ways. Yeah, Mrs. Castillo.
So you're saying there was no reason, where did this start from, these pogroms? Like, was there like, we have to cross and kill the infidels? Was there like, it's hard to understand that it just started out of nothing.
Okay, so if you look, there are a lot of things you can find online, like from different Jewish history, podcasts and shiurim and stuff like that. And also from this Yevon Metsula, he talks a little bit about it at the beginning. I don't want to go into it so much just because it's not really our topic, but in general, it came a little bit from the whole system in Poland, where the Polish people were at the top, the Jewish community were like the middle class, and then the Ukrainians were the bottom. And the Polish people, as they would torture the Ukrainians, and and demand taxes from them and all those kinds of things, they would have the Jewish, the Jewish middle class would be in charge of collecting the taxes and that kind of stuff. So the Ukrainians did see the Jewish community as being somewhat of, the people who were, let's say, like abusing them. But it was coming from the Polish, right? They knew it was coming from the Polish. And if you look at the Yevon Metsula, the Ukrainians don't really attack the Polish nearly as much as they attack the Jewish community. In fact, at the beginning, the Ukrainians offered, kind of for the Polish to help them attack the Jewish community. It's a pretty complex story, so there's a lot more to say. You're right that it doesn't come out of nowhere exactly, but he talks about how the Ukrainians were very anti-Semitic. Instead of putting their anger on the Polish people who had actually been torturing them, right, they put it on the Jewish community who were also being tortured by the Polish, right? So it didn't really make a lot of sense. But you can look there and see, and see more about that. I'll just mention, there are many great sources for Jewish history out there, like of course Rabbi Wine's book, and others as well. And if you enjoy listening to something instead of reading, Rabbi Irons, if you go to rabbiirons, I think .com, he has, from Detroit, right? He has amazing classes on Jewish history. There are really a lot. I mainly teach Jewish history, so I'm always happy to share resources on where to find more about Jewish history. There are so many resources out there that are sadly not very well known, but they're really fantastic. So if anyone wants more resources on learning Jewish history in general or on something we've discussed, then please let me know. I'm happy to share those resources. Okay, and they're very readily available. A lot of them are available online, and a lot of the books should be in really like any Jewish library or Sfarim store. Okay, so let's discuss some of the let's say like the strategies, right, that Sheker here used, let's say, to fool the Jewish community. And as we've discussed, this is really going to be an example of how people fooled themselves. Okay, we don't even have Shabtai Tzvi in the story yet. It's really going to be how the people at the time were fooling themselves, right, to be ready for whatever comes. So the first thing that I want to say is that here the first strategy is using emotion, right? Speaking to a person's emotion, using an emotional argument. Here in this story, right, we saw that there was a tremendous amount of pain. And yeah, there was pain for a reason, right? It was a painful time. This is not something, they weren't wrong to be in pain, right? This was a painful experience. And what happened was they really had two options, right? Option number one was to decide that, all of these people were killed and tortured, and all of this took place for no apparent reason, right? And now we just have to continue living in Galus because Mashiach didn't come. And we just, whatever's going to come, more centuries of torture, more centuries of tragedy, more centuries of persecution and suffering, right? And basically, we've gained nothing. All of these people have died. We've gained nothing. We're still in Galus. We're still confronting whatever comes next, right? And like, what did we gain here? We gained nothing. We lost a lot, we suffered a lot, and we gained nothing. That was basically option number one. Option number two, now again, I don't think they were thinking this in their minds, right? But there was, it was there. These were the two options. Option number two is to say these people, they were tortured and they did die. But their death brings about the most important moment in history, the happiest moment, the moment of Mashiach, a time when we'll be reunited with the whole Jewish community. We'll be reunited with everyone who's been lost to us. We will finally, be able to be proud Jews. We'll be connected to Hashem. We'll be happy. We won't suffer anymore. Right? And all of these people who died here and were tortured, all of that will be for the sake of something amazing. Something that we've all been waiting for so long, right? And we don't need to be in fear anymore, and we don't need to suffer. And of course, that would be to say that this is the Chavli Mashiach, and Mashiach is coming. Now, when you think about those two options, people who just went through the kind of trauma that we should never know of, right? And the kind of trauma, there were a few individuals that were survived in different ways from these attacks against the Polish community. And they came to the other Jewish communities. They were taken in and taken care of. And of course, the other Jewish communities were hearing what had taken place, right? And everyone at the time, they were living with this trauma and this shock and this pain. And so many people had lost, their whole community and all of their family and their loved ones. I mean, it's just shocking and horrifying. So they had the option. Either they could just move on, right? And that's it. And now we're still in Gullus and we just have to live with the pain, right? Or they can live with the idea that, you know what? This all happened for the sake of something so happy and exciting. For the sake of Mashiach, their death is something so important and it brought about a huge happiness to the Jewish community, and we'll be reunited with them and we'll be happy and we won't suffer. Right? And of course, our minds, right, we don't look at this again like a logical, like, oh, either option A or option B, right? It doesn't work like that. We don't allow ourselves to entertain the terrible, terrible idea that the reality might be that Gullus is just going to continue and that's it. We can't really allow ourselves to think that way. So here the people found themselves in really with a challenge of confronting the reality that just seemed too painful. And so many of them, right, gave into these emotions and this insistence that it had to be that this was Mashiach. Now, obviously, I'm not faulting them for this, obviously, right? This is something so beyond painful, right? It's not just about judging them. It's that this is something which is so painful. We literally we cannot imagine what they went through, right? And they wanted that this should be Mashiach. Mashiach is something, it's so happy. It's something that we all hope for. Every single day we ask Hashem for Mashiach, right? So this is something which makes sense. It makes sense that they did this. However, the problem is that it was based on their emotions. It was based on their emotions. It doesn't mean that it couldn't have been Mashiach, right? It doesn't mean that maybe with a certain, maybe, they should have taken it as an opportunity to do tshuva and, all of the things that are necessary in order to prepare for Mashiach. That might be true. But the problem is that the emotion took over and it blinded them. And what happened was it blinded them and it made them vulnerable. And it made them vulnerable to Shabtai Tzvi and his group. And now they had an easy way of fooling all of these people. Now, the problem with this is, the reality is, that what happened with Shabtai Tzvi is that it was a painful experience, Shabtai Tzvi, and we'll discuss this. But the result of so many people believing in Shabtai Tzvi is that it caused more pain. And at the end of the story of Shabtai Tzvi, not only did they have to deal with the pain of Tach V'Tat, they also had to deal with the pain of this false Messiah. And in the end, it caused more pain. It didn't fix anything. It didn't. All it did was cause more pain. And so the problem is, and this is really the real point, is that just because we want something to be true, it doesn't make it true. Again, just because we want something to be true doesn't make it true. And the problem is that we can all understand where they were coming from. We're not blaming them. It makes sense that they took this approach. The problem is that it wasn't based on the reality of what was taking place. It was based on their emotions, and it caused them more pain in the end. Maybe it temporarily numbed the pain, but it didn't fix the problem, and it caused more pain. And we're going to discuss it really caused a lot of pain for the Jewish community. And when I think about it, I always get upset when I think about that. Not only did the Jewish community have to experience the Khmelnytsky pogroms, which were beyond horrifying, but they then had a whole huge tragedy that came next that just added to the pain. And it's so, so sad to think about the fact that their way of numbing the pain just made it so much worse. And so it's something for us to keep in mind, is that we don't want to let our emotions fool us, because we don't win in the end. Again, just because we want something to be true, it doesn't make it true. And if it's not true, then we have to be careful, right? We don't want our emotions to take over. Even if it's understandable, it might be understandable why emotions do take over, but it's not going to end up accomplishing the right thing. So we have to be so, so careful. And again, emotional arguments can be used when someone's trying to fool someone else. That definitely happens, right? And we, maybe we'll discuss some examples, but also if you look out for this, you'll see this all the time. Emotional arguments are always being used to deceive others. And we'll discuss this a little bit more in this course, a few other kinds of examples. But again, it's something which we can fool ourselves, right? We have emotions and they blind us sometimes to seeing the exact truth of what's really taking place, to seeing the reality. And the only one who really ends up losing out is us. And that's the thing we have to remember. When we let our emotions blind us, the only people who lose out is us. It's not worth it, right? Again, it's easier said than done, right? But it's something to keep in mind is that emotions are very, very, very powerful. And they leave us vulnerable to all kinds of threats. And we have to really make sure that we're being, that we're protecting ourselves, okay? That we're not letting our emotions take over. I want to just mention that one of the ways that I think that we can protect ourselves, let's say, from our own emotions or from, emotional arguments that are being used by others, is really one of the ways that I think is through the study of Musar. In Livnos, we have a bunch of Musar classes. A lot of the teachers are, love to teach Musar, as many of you know. And Musar, one of the things that Musar does is it really forces us to stop and to step out of ourselves and to say, did I do this because it's the right thing? It's what the Torah wants of me? Or did I do this because it's what I wanted, right? It's what I wanted it to be true. Or I got lazy or whatever it is. So I think the study of Musar to me is something which helps ground me and reminds me, hold on, take a step back, gotta be careful. It's really what the study of Musar is, right? It's really that constant reminder that our emotions are very powerful at fooling us, right? What we want to be true can often blind us to the reality of what's taking place. And again, even though in the moment it might seem easier or nicer or more convenient, in the bigger picture, we're the ones who lose out. So it's something for us to be very careful about. Okay. Any questions, any comments? Okay. One more strategy here that I think, yeah, Ms. Kosaski, yeah.
I hope everyone else talks. I don't want to be the only one talking. Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment that this problem still happens today. Every single time, like with October 7th this year, but before that, the Intifada, every time something big goes down, I get a million ridiculous WhatsApps from people that Mashiach's coming, and it was this year, and this book couple said this, and Rav Chaim Kanievsky said that, and this one said this. And it's like this rush to say Mashiach is here. And it's kind of like not learning from our past mistakes.
Exactly.
So we're supposed to wait from him every day, but we're not supposed to, in a huff and a puff of emotion, if something bad happens, turn it into we're all going to meet in Yerushalayim tomorrow because there was a massacre in Jerusalem today.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Thank you. Yeah, that's really the second strategy here that, let's say, Sheker uses, right? I don't know a good name for all of our all the things we're going to point out, but definitely here I wanted to point out that although the emotional argument is maybe the overall, tool, but it's important to discuss the concept of the obsession with Mashiach, right? Which is something that we see all the time, right? Every single thing that happens, the response that everyone has is, it's Mashiach, right? And as we've seen, not always, that's not really what happens in the end, right? So it's something for us. I want to discuss that specifically because it's so important for us as Torah Jews to, keep our head on, right? And to know, like, how do we approach this whole concept of like, oh, it's Mashiach, it's Mashiach, it's Mashiach. Like, how do we have a healthy kind of approach to that? Now, there's a lot to say on this subject, but just to sum up, I thought there were a few things we could discuss just to make sure that we're, having that right balance of waiting for Mashiach and also in an appropriate way, right? Because we see with Shabtai Tzvi's story, it went too far, right? It was not done in a fully appropriate way, and this does seem to be a theme of Jewish history that we've seen. And you're right that no matter what happened in the Jewish community, right, the first response always is that it has to be that this is Mashiach. And we've seen that that again, we can understand where that's coming from, right? The Jewish community, every single thing that takes place, right? Sometimes there is a terrorist attack in which one person is killed, And that one person, the whole Jewish community is reeling from the fact that someone was killed, right? None of these situations, none of them, they're not nothing, right? Not everything that happens every single time a Jew is attacked, right? It's basically unendurable for the rest of the Jewish community, right? And we see this, it's happening every time it happens, right? The immediate response from all over the Jewish world is, oh, this must be Mashiach, right? And of course, not to in any way, let's say, not to, simplify, let's say, those experiences, right? It's true. Every time a Jew is attacked, it is painful, and it should be painful. It's horrifying. Even if one life is taken, right? It's horrifying. It's something we should all feel the pain of the fact that a Jew was killed, right? That's not something that to be taken light at all. And yeah, as we've seen, it does seem to be a little bit of a funny response, maybe not funny, but a little bit of an interesting response that something happens, which is a tragedy, but compared to the tragedies of Jewish history, it's somewhat minor, right? And the first thing you see is, oh, it's got to be Mashiach. How can it possibly be that this is not Mashiach? It's a little bit of a weird response, right? If Tach B'Tah and the Holocaust and all those things, like those were major things that took place, right? And if every time, like, oh, gas goes up $1 a gallon, and all of a sudden, like, this must be Mashiach, it's like a little bit of a funny response. Like, that, really? Like, that's how it works? I don't think so, right? So I want to just discuss for a second, like, how do we approach this, right? Because as things take place, it's also not nothing. Again, it's not nothing. If there's a terrorist attack, those are things that we don't take lightly. It's very, very difficult, right? And always what it does is it basically puts the Jewish community in this mode of, how much can we take? How much can we take? So much. There's so much. It's not just what's taking place right now, let's say in the last year, right? But it's that here we are so worn out from Gullus. It's 2,000 years of pain. It's not just what happens, in this moment in our lives or in our own lifetimes. It's what's happened for the last 2,000 years. We've been through so much, and we carry that pain with us. That pain hasn't left, right? Every time, we learn something in Jewish history, we experience that pain all over again. That pain is not limited to the past. We feel it now. And we are people now. We have 2,000 years of suffering that we've endured. It's really hard. So how can the Jewish community, how do we stand here and we say, like, how much more can we take? How do we do this? How do we continue on? And the thing is that the right response to this is that it is really hard. And in Jewish history, so many people have struggled and they've confronted huge challenges. And the response always is to continue serving Hashem, because that's our only job. Our job is to serve Hashem. And the thing is that in historically, people did not always jump to the conclusion that this is Mashiach. It wasn't how it worked. It wasn't that every time a tragedy happens, the first response is, this must be Mashiach. Because who says Mashiach is going to come in exactly the time that Hashem plans for it to come? We have no idea. We have no idea when it's going to come. And you know what? We don't need to calculate. We don't need to know. We don't need to know. It's not for us. It's not our job. It's not our responsibility. We have one responsibility. Our responsibility is that we have to serve Hashem always, no matter what the situation is, no matter if we're born into a time of Gullus or a time of Geula, no matter if we're born into, a happier time of Gullus or a less happy time, though, Gullus has always been difficult. So not sure how much of a different, how many happy times there were, but it doesn't matter what time we experience. It's always, always, always for us to do one job. We have one responsibility. It's to serve Hashem. It's to learn Torah. It's to do mitzvos. It's to daven. It's to do tshuva. It's to strengthen our emunah. It's to accept every single thing that Hashem sends us, because Hashem knows best. He's good at his job, and he knows exactly what should happen now. If he's chosen that right now we are in Gullus, that's exactly what's supposed to take place. That's it. And he knows when to bring Mashiach. He's got it all figured out. We have one job, which is to remain loyal to him. So here the thing is that the Jewish community in the past, even when they lived through pain and suffering, they channeled that into strengthening their emunah with Hashem and into accepting that this is what Hashem sent and that they have one responsibility, which is to continue keeping the Torah. It wasn't that they looked for a way out. We are now used to this concept that if there's suffering, then we have to look for a way out. In some way, in some way, we need to force Hashem to bring the end. But that wasn't the answer that they looked for. Because if Hashem said, it's time for you to serve me through suffering, then that was it. It was time for them to serve Hashem through suffering. That was the answer. They didn't need to know when Mashiach would come and this and no. Hashem put them into the situation. That's it. Hashem put some people into a situation where they can serve Hashem through peace and through an easier life. And Hashem put some people into a situation where they're supposed to serve Him during the Holocaust or during something insanely painful. We don't know why. We have no idea why, how Hashem makes those calculations. Why? We don't know. We don't know why. Hashem knows. But if Hashem chose it, it's right. And therefore, all of the people in history, the Jews who were strong Jews before modern history, they accepted that this is what Hashem sent them, and they weren't looking for a way out because we don't need a way out. If Hashem chose us, it's perfect. And they were strong enough and mature enough to say, I accept what Hashem has sent me, and I am committed to serving Him through it all. And that is something which changed. And now we see this concept, this obsession with Mashiach, right? Which is that we demand, Hashem, we need Mashiach now. We're demanding, it must be, but it's not our job. Now, there's really so much to say about this. I don't know how time flies, and there's so much to say, so I don't want to keep you much longer. Next time, what we're going to do, we're going to continue right here. We're going to talk more about this concept of Mashiach because it's so important. And it's so important in general in our lives because, again, we see this all the time, right? Especially now with what's taking place. And really all the time, right? This constant theme of we need Mashiach right this minute. So it's something that we're going to talk about. But it's also very important for us because as we go through the story of Shabtai Tzvi, we need to have the right understanding of what is Mashiach? What is the purpose, right? What are we waiting for? How do we know when Mashiach is here? How do we know what to look out for? How we're the end and, right? If the Torah tells us what to look out for, right? So then, did they see those signs in the times of Shabtai Tzvi, right? How did Shabtai Tzvi, what was going on? Did he present himself in a way that actually seemed to be what Mashiach should be according to the Torah? Okay, we have a lot more to say on this. Next time, what we're going to do is continue from here again, talking more about the concept of waiting for Mashiach, okay, and always thinking that it's almost Mashiach. And then we're also going to mention another 2 tools for protecting ourselves from the, strategies of Sheker that we just saw. We mentioned 2 strategies of Sheker, and we're going to have to also show tools for protecting ourselves from the Sheker, for strengthening ourselves. That's very, very important. So I want to just sum up before we end off. I just want to sum up what we did tonight and, bring it all together, right? First, we mentioned the concept that what happens in history, right, is theme. These are themes of human nature. These are themes that the Torah warns us about and prepares us for, right? So as we look at the story, we're going to make sure that we're constantly asking, how is this relevant to us, right? So that's something, again, as you go through your week, think about that, right? And think if anything pops into your head, as you look around the world, how do you see maybe some of what we've discussed tonight? And then we've discussed that the background to the story is the events of Tach B'Tad, of the Khmelnytsky pogroms, right? And this shock and this trauma and this pain that confronted the Jewish community at this time and really put them in a vulnerable situation in which they wanted something happy, something that would comfort them in this difficult time. But as we mentioned, the thing that they sought, comfort in, right, was not true comfort. And it was something which ended up betraying them, right, and leaving them in an even more painful situation in the end. So we will review this again next time when we start, and we'll continue this line of thinking.